there's a specific moment that stays with you forever. The moment you realize your own family is enjoying your collapse. Mine came at a backyard barbecue, 11 months after I'd lost my business, my savings, and very nearly my sense of who I was, when my brother-in-law raised his beer toward me across the picnic table and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, at least we know who not to take investment advice from anymore," and the whole table laughed, actually laughed, while I sat there holding a paper plate of potato salad, smiling, because that's what you do, smiling because the alternative was letting them see exactly how deep that comment had landed. I want to tell you what happened in the year between that barbecue and the phone call that came almost exactly 12 months later, the call where my sister, her voice tight and unfamiliar, in a way I'd never heard from her before, asked if there was any way at all, that I could help. My name doesn't matter much here. What matters is that 6 years ago, I did something my family considered reckless from the very beginning. I left a stable, well-paying corporate job to start my own business, a small but ambitious specialty food company built around products I'd developed myself, sauces and preserves rooted in recipes from my grandmother's kitchen, the kind of thing that felt, to me, like genuine purpose after years of sitting in meetings about quarterly projections for a company I'd never particularly cared about. My family did not share my excitement. My father, Therold, a man who had worked the same accounting job for 31 years and genuinely believed that stability was the highest achievable virtue, made his skepticism clear from the moment I told him. "You're giving up a good, secure position," he said, "for something that might not even exist in 2 years. That's not ambition, that's recklessness." My mother, Carol, worried more quietly but no less persistently, calling every few weeks during those early years to ask, gently but pointedly, whether I'd thought about maybe going back to something more traditional, just to have something to fall back on. My older sister, Michelle, was the most openly dismissive of everyone, treating my new venture less like a legitimate business and more like an extended, slightly embarrassing hobby I hadn't yet outgrown. Her husband, Todd, the same brother-in-law who would later make that comment at the barbecue, had a habit throughout those years of asking, at every family gathering, with a tone that always sounded like genuine curiosity but never quite was, "So, is the sauce thing actually profitable yet? Or is it more of a passion project situation?" I built that business anyway, slowly, carefully, funding it initially with my own savings and later with a modest small business loan I secured after 2 years of steady, if unglamorous, growth. By year 4, I had a genuine local following, 3 full-time employees, and a distribution deal with a regional grocery chain that felt, at the time, like the beginning of something much bigger. I threw myself into that business completely, working 70-hour weeks, sacrificing what felt, in retrospect, like an entire chapter of a more balanced personal life, because I believed, genuinely and deeply, that I was building something worth all of it. The collapse, when it came, wasn't the result of any single catastrophic mistake, which somehow made it harder to explain to a family that had already decided the whole venture was destined to fail. A combination of factors converged within the span of about 8 months. A key supplier relationship fell apart unexpectedly when the supplier's own business was sold to a larger company that discontinued the specific ingredient line I'd built several core products around. The regional grocery chain, undergoing its own financial restructuring, terminated a significant portion of its specialty foods contracts, including mine, with relatively little notice, and a batch quality issue, ultimately traced back to that same disrupted supplier relationship, resulted in a costly product recall that drained cash reserves I'd been counting on to weather exactly this kind of disruption. By the time I fully understood the scope of what was happening, it was already, functionally, too late to save the business through any means short of an infusion of capital I simply didn't have and couldn't secure quickly enough. I spent nearly 4 months trying everything I could think of, renegotiating supplier terms, seeking emergency financing, cutting costs to the bone, laying off employees I genuinely cared about in a desperate attempt to keep the core of the business alive. None of it was enough. I formally closed the business just over 5 years after I'd started it, filing for a personal bankruptcy shortly afterward, because I'd personally guaranteed several of the business loans, a decision that had felt reasonable and confident at the time, and felt, in the aftermath, like the single most painful financial mistake of my life. I want to be honest about what that period actually felt like from the inside, because I think it's important for understanding everything that came after. It wasn't just financial loss, though the financial loss was severe. My savings gone, my credit destroyed, a bankruptcy that would follow me for years. It was a complete collapse of identity. For 5 years, I had been someone who built things, someone whose work had genuine purpose and momentum. Overnight, I became someone starting over from nothing, 38 years old, moving back into a small rented apartment I could barely afford on the entry-level administrative job I managed to find within a stressful, humbling 6 weeks of searching. A job that used almost none of the skills or experience I'd spent the previous decade developing. My family's reaction to all of this, in the months immediately following the collapse, revealed something about them that I don't think I'd ever let myself see quite so clearly before. There was very little actual comfort offered, and a surprising amount of what I can only describe as vindication, thinly disguised as concern. My father's first substantive comment, delivered during a phone call about 2 weeks after I'd told the family the business was closing, was, "I did try to warn you about this, you know. Sometimes these things just aren't meant to work out the way we hope." My mother's version of support mostly consisted of repeated suggestions that I move back into my childhood bedroom until things stabilize, suggestions that, while perhaps genuinely well-intentioned, carried an undertone of returning me to a dependent status I'd spent years actively trying to leave behind. Michelle and Todd were, without question, the worst of it. At a family dinner about a month after the closure, Todd made a comment, apparently intended as lighthearted, about how he'd always said the sauce business seemed like a stretch, a comment he delivered with a small laugh that clearly expected me to laugh along with him. Michelle, rather than defending me or even staying neutral, actually added to it, saying something about how she'd worried this exact thing might happen for years, framing her sister's total financial and professional collapse as a prediction fulfilled rather than a genuine tragedy deserving of actual sympathy. The barbecue comment, the one about investment advice, came about 11 months after the business closed, at a gathering ostensibly meant to celebrate my nephew's birthday. I'd shown up that day genuinely trying, having slowly, painfully begun rebuilding some sense of stability. A modest promotion at my administrative job, a slightly better apartment, small, incremental signs of progress I was quietly proud of, despite how far they were from where I'd been just a year earlier. Todd's comment, delivered casually over beer and burgers, landed with a specific, sharp humiliation precisely because it came in front of extended family and friends who hadn't been closely following my situation, people who laughed along without understanding the actual weight of what they were laughing at, people who, I realized in that moment, now saw me primarily through the lens of my failure rather than anything I'd actually built or attempted. I didn't say anything in response. Not really, beyond a tight smile and a quick change of subject. I drove home that evening and sat in my car in the apartment parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before I could bring myself to go inside, turning that comment over and over, feeling something harden inside me that I couldn't quite name yet, something between grief and resolve. I want to be clear that what happened over the following year wasn't some deliberate, calculated plan for revenge, not in the way that phrase usually implies. I didn't sit down and strategize how to eventually put my family in a position where they'd need my help. What actually happened was simpler and, in its own way, more honest. I quietly, privately, without any family involvement or awareness, began rebuilding, slowly and carefully, learning from every mistake that had contributed to the business's collapse, taking on freelance consulting work in the food industry using the hard-won expertise I'd developed, work that gradually, over months, began generating meaningful income beyond my administrative salary. I also, during that year, made a decision that surprised even myself. I stopped sharing details of my financial recovery with my family entirely. Not out of spite, exactly, but out of a genuine, protective instinct I hadn't fully recognized in myself before. I'd spent years having my ambitions dismissed, my setbacks mocked, and something in me finally, quietly decided that my continued rebuilding didn't need to be performed for an audience that had shown, repeatedly, exactly how they responded to both my successes and my failures. I told them, when asked, vague, minimal updates, things are stabilizing, work is going okay, nothing that revealed the actual trajectory of what was happening. By the time that year had passed, my freelance consulting work had grown substantially, several clients in the specialty food industry paying me meaningfully for exactly the kind of expertise my own failed business had, painfully, taught me. I'd paid off a significant portion of the debt remaining from the bankruptcy proceedings faster than the court-mandated timeline required, rebuilt a modest but genuine emergency savings fund, and had begun, quietly, exploring the possibility of eventually starting a smaller, more carefully structured business again, this time with lessons learned that I felt confident would prevent the specific vulnerabilities that had brought down the first venture. None of my family knew any of this. As far as they were concerned, I was still the sister and daughter who'd had her reckless dream collapse, still working an entry-level administrative job, still, in their private assessment, a cautionary tale about the dangers of leaving stable employment for uncertain ambition. The phone call that changed everything came almost exactly a year after that barbecue, on a Tuesday evening while I was finishing dinner alone in my apartment. It was Michelle, and I knew immediately, from the specific tightness in her voice, that something was genuinely wrong, a quality of distress I hadn't heard from my normally composed, occasionally condescending older sister in longer than I could remember. Todd's business, it turned out, a mid-sized construction supply company he'd run for nearly a decade, was in serious trouble. A combination of factors eerily similar to what had happened to my own business, a key supplier relationship collapsing, a major client contract falling through unexpectedly, cash flow problems compounding faster than they could manage, had brought the company to the edge of a crisis that, without some kind of intervention, would likely result in the same kind of collapse I'd experienced the year before. Michelle explained, haltingly, that they'd exhausted their own savings trying to keep the business afloat, that their bank had denied an emergency loan application given the company's suddenly precarious financial position, and that they were, she admitted with visible difficulty, running out of options. "I know this is probably really awkward to ask," she said, "given everything that happened with your business. But you understand this industry, this kind of situation, better than almost anyone we know. Is there any way you could look at what's going on, maybe help us figure out some options? We're genuinely running out of time here." I sat with that request for a long moment before responding, feeling a complicated mixture of things I hadn't fully anticipated feeling, even though some distant part of me had, perhaps, imagined a moment somewhat like this one during the harder stretches of the preceding year. There was, I'll admit honestly, a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction, the specific, quiet vindication of being asked for expert help by the exact people who had mocked that same expertise a year earlier. But underneath that flicker, more prominent than I expected, was something closer to genuine concern. Because whatever complicated feelings I had about my family's treatment of me, I didn't actually want to see Todd and Michelle lose everything the way I had. Didn't want my young nephew's family to go through the same collapse I'd barely survived myself. "I can look at it," I told her, "but I want to be clear about something first. If I'm going to help, it needs to be a real, structured engagement, not just casual family advice over dinner. I'll treat this the same way I'd treat any consulting client, professional terms, clear boundaries, and yes, that includes being compensated fairly for my time and expertise, the same way it would for anyone else I work with." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear, in that pause, Michelle recalibrating something in real time, adjusting to a version of me she clearly hadn't expected to encounter. Someone confident, someone establishing professional boundaries rather than simply offering free, unconditional family support the way she'd perhaps assumed I would. "Of course," she said, finally. "Whatever you think is fair, we're just genuinely grateful you're willing to look at it at all." I met with Todd and Michelle 2 days later, not at a family dinner but in what I deliberately structured as a professional consultation, complete with a formal engagement letter I'd drafted using the same template I used for my other consulting clients, outlining scope of work, fees, and expectations clearly. A document I watched Todd read through with an expression that shifted, over the course of those few minutes, from mild surprise to something closer to genuine respect. The specific respect people extend when they realize they're dealing with someone whose competence they'd previously, and incorrectly, dismissed. The consulting work itself took several intense weeks, reviewing Todd's company finances in detail, identifying exactly where the cash flow problems were originating, negotiating directly with the supplier whose collapsed relationship had triggered much of the crisis, using industry contacts and negotiation strategies I'd developed, painfully, through my own business's failure the year before. I found, working through Todd's company's problems, a strange, useful clarity, recognizing patterns I'd lived through myself, applying lessons that had cost me everything to learn, in a context where, this time, I had the chance to prevent the same catastrophic outcome for someone else. Over the following 2 months, working closely with Todd and, increasingly, with genuine collaborative respect between us, we managed to stabilize the company's immediate crisis, restructuring supplier agreements, securing a bridge loan through a smaller regional lender I'd developed a relationship with during my own consulting work, and implementing new cash flow management practices that addressed the underlying vulnerabilities that had allowed the crisis to develop in the first place. Todd's business survived, not in some dramatic, cinematic turnaround, but through the same kind of careful, unglamorous work I'd once tried, unsuccessfully, to apply to my own failing company. I remember the specific moment, near the end of that engagement, when Todd, sitting across from me at his own kitchen table, this time rather than a backyard picnic bench, said something that had clearly been sitting uncomfortably with him for weeks. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for that comment I made last year, at Kyle's birthday, about investment advice. I've thought about it a lot these past couple months. Honestly, I didn't understand, at all, what actually went wrong with your business until I watched almost the exact same thing start happening to mine. It wasn't recklessness. It was just bad luck hitting at the wrong moment, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone running a business, including me, apparently." I appreciated the apology, genuinely, though I noticed, and I think it's honest to admit this, that some part of me had wanted it to come sooner, unprompted by his own crisis, rather than only after he'd personally experienced something similar. But I also recognized, in that acknowledgement, something valuable, a genuine shift in how he understood not just my situation, but the actual nature of business risk itself. A shift that hadn't been possible when the concept remained purely theoretical to him. Michelle's shift was, in some ways, more significant, because it extended beyond just an apology into a genuine reassessment of how she'd treated my ambitions over the years, dating back well before the business's collapse. About a month after the consulting engagement concluded, she called me, not about Todd's business this time, but simply to talk, and in that conversation, she admitted something that surprised me with its honesty. "I think I've spent years assuming that because you took a bigger risk than I ever would, that meant you were somehow less careful, less serious than the rest of us who stayed in stable, predictable jobs. Watching you handle Todd's crisis, so calmly, so competently, I realized how wrong that assumption was. You weren't reckless, you were just brave in a way I never was, and when it didn't work out, I think I used that as confirmation of something I'd already decided about you, instead of actually seeing what happened clearly." My parents' reaction, once they learned the full scope of what had happened, both my quiet financial recovery over the preceding year and the substantial help I'd provided Todd and Michelle, was more complicated, layered with a mixture of genuine pride and, I think, some discomfort at having to reconcile their earlier dismissiveness with the reality of who I'd actually become through the hardest period of my life. My father, in particular, struggled visibly with this reconciliation, offering, during one phone call, a somewhat backhanded acknowledgement along the lines of, "Well, it's good you were able to turn things around, even if the original decision to start that business still seems risky to me," a comment that revealed, I think, exactly how difficult it was for him to fully separate my eventual competence from his original skepticism about the choice that led to my earlier struggles. I didn't need his full validation, though. Not by that point. Something had shifted in me, over that year of quiet, private rebuilding, a kind of self-assurance that no longer depended quite so heavily on my family's approval or understanding. I'd learned, through genuine hardship, exactly what I was capable of, and that knowledge, hard-won and private for most of that year, mattered more to my own sense of self than any belated family recognition ever could, even though the recognition, when it eventually came, was genuinely meaningful too. I want to be honest that helping Todd and Michelle wasn't some calculated act of revenge, engineered to make them regret their earlier mockery. I genuinely wanted to help, both because I cared about my nephew's family stability and because the work itself, applying hard-won expertise to prevent someone else from experiencing the collapse I'd survived, felt genuinely meaningful to me, separate from whatever complicated family history surrounded the request. But I also won't pretend there wasn't something quietly, undeniably satisfying about the specific shape of how it unfolded, about being asked, professionally and respectfully, for exactly the expertise that had once been mocked at a backyard picnic table, about setting clear boundaries around that help, rather than simply offering it unconditionally, the way old family patterns might have once compelled me to. In the months since, I've started that smaller, more carefully structured business I'd been quietly considering during my year of private rebuilding, a consulting practice focused specifically on helping small food and beverage businesses navigate exactly the kind of supply chain and cash flow vulnerabilities that had brought down my own original venture. It's grown steadily, carefully, built this time on lessons I paid an enormous price to learn, and structured, deliberately, to avoid the specific fragilities that had once left me so exposed. My relationship with my family has genuinely improved since that year. Not perfectly, not without occasional reminders of old patterns resurfacing in smaller ways, but with a foundation that feels more honest than what existed before, built now on actual demonstrated competence and mutual respect, rather than the earlier dynamic where my ambitions were dismissed until proven, exhaustively, beyond any reasonable doubt. I don't think of what happened as revenge, not in any satisfying, engineered sense. What actually happened was something quieter and, I think, ultimately more meaningful. A year of private, unglamorous rebuilding that nobody witnessed or acknowledged, followed by a moment when that rebuilding simply, undeniably, spoke for itself, not because I orchestrated some triumphant reveal, but because life, in its own unpredictable way, created a situation where the exact expertise once mocked became suddenly, urgently necessary, and I got to offer it, this time, on my own terms, with boundaries I'd earned the right to set. I think about that barbecue often, Todd's comment about investment advice, the easy laughter around that picnic table, and I think about how differently that same table might respond now, a year and a half later, if the subject of my business history came up again. I don't need them to fully understand everything I went through during that hardest year of my life. Don't need some dramatic, complete reckoning with every dismissive comment that preceded it. What I have now, instead, feels more valuable than that kind of theatrical vindication. A genuine, if imperfect, shift in how my family sees me, earned not through argument or confrontation, but through the simple, undeniable fact of showing up, competently and generously, exactly when it mattered most, on terms that were entirely my own. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the countless quiet stories of resilience and family reckoning so many of us carry. If any part of it felt familiar to you, tell me in the comments which moment landed hardest, and stay close for the next story in this series. Because sometimes the truest kind of vindication isn't loud at all. It's just quietly, steadily, becoming exactly who you always knew you could be, whether anyone was watching or not.